And we are on. Michael Quirke here with Climate Change National Forum. This is our virtual session at Earth Day, Texas on the divestment movement. I have with me Ben Franta, a PhD candidate in applied physics at Harvard University and a leader, a board member of the Divest Harvard movement, which just put on its Heat Week, which is an awareness week with, kind of, I guess, protests and events, kind of bringing awareness to the, and making the call for Harvard to divest. I also have with me Geoffrey Supran, a MIT Energy Fellow, a graduate student at MIT, and also a leader of the MIT Divest Group. Two schools that have active kind of divestment movements, that are leaders in the divestment movement, and we're here to talk about just kind of the origins of this movement and what y'all intend to achieve by it, spoken from the leaders. We've had a lot of virtual sessions right here. This is the first time we've had folks to speak on divestment. So I guess we'll start with you, Ben Franta. Lulu Louie just posted on an interview with you talking about the origins of divestment. So if you could real briefly tell me, how did this movement get started and what you intend to achieve?
Yeah, so this movement really got big in 2012, or it started to. It actually originated in Swarthmore College in the Northeast U.S. A student group there was particularly interested in mountaintop removal coal mining and getting Swarthmore to stop investing in coal companies. Now, the activist organization 350.org, which is probably the biggest global climate activist organization, noticed this movement and they were interested in it. They thought this could be interesting to try to scale up and see if there's really a demand for this sort of thing out there. So they seeded the campaigns. One of those was Harvard in the fall of 2012. And at that time, there were probably only about maybe 10 campaigns in existence. And then it just started to snowball. So,
real briefly, what is it? What is the divestment movement?
Yeah, good question. So divestment is the opposite of investment. When you pull your investments out of a particular sector or a particular company, often people will do this as an act of protest, or because what the company is doing is ceases to be socially responsible or something like that. So some prominent examples from the past include institutional divestment from tobacco companies in the 90s, and divestment from companies doing business in apartheid South Africa, mostly in the 80s. So those are a couple of the more prominent examples. There have been some more recent ones as well to do with like companies implicated in genocide in South Sudan.
And so correct me if I'm wrong, the movement is basically calling on institutions to divest their assets in fossil fuel stocks. Geoffrey, MIT just recently had a whole debate on this, a very different reaction from Harvard in terms of the divestment movement. So I guess, explain about, your perspective on it as a leader and possibly kind of what MIT is doing.
Sure, yeah. So just like at Harvard and around the country, at MIT we're calling on the administration to divest or de-invest our $12.5 billion endowment from the fossil fuel industry. And as you mentioned, certainly the dynamic of the debate has been, the divestment debate has been very different at MIT compared to Harvard. But the ask is very much the same. So to kind of put in the context of the MIT situation, really it came about because I'm a physicist and a material science engineer by training. And I found myself and my colleagues found ourselves sitting in the labs at MIT being paid, to build the next generation of solar cells and LED technologies, renewable energy basically, to tackle the climate crisis. And what we were very dismayed to realize we were part of this snowball effect that Ben described, this sort of rollout of divestment campaigns around the country, that really highlighted that while MIT and other universities are fighting climate change with, the one hand, paying grad students like myself and Ben to do this renewable energy work, the universities are really feeding it with the other hand, investing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in the fossil fuel industry, basically whose fundamental business practice is scientifically incompatible with the science of climate change mitigation. And also, does a lot of bad things along the way. So it's really those things.
Yeah, and Ben, you mentioned this in the interview with Lulu, talking about the concept of stranded assets and the current reserves that we have. And in the forum, Shell's CO2 advisor David Hone has actually mentioned that to keep warming within around 2 degrees Celsius, we can only emit about 1 trillion tons of carbon. And we've already emitted about a little over half of that. Yet our reserves are far more vast than 1 trillion tons. And that's the concept of stranded assets, correct? Is because these assets are currently valued on the presumption that they're going to be burnt and emitted, correct?
Kind of a combination of different motivations for doing something related to divestment. There's the ethical argument that it's not right to invest in companies that are not socially responsible to do so anymore. And then there's this financial argument to the stranded assets. Now, the interesting part is that these arguments are essentially mutually reinforcing, because the more people move on the moral argument, the more likely it is that these assets really be stranded. And that reinforces the financial argument. Of course, if the cycle of that stranded financially, then it's also easier to move on the moral argument too.
Yeah, because if they are stranded, then it means that there is going to be some successful climate mitigation. If there's not, then they aren't stranded. Yeah. But then again, what are the limitations of this? Even MIT with its billions of dollars, you're only talking about a market influence of so much. Not to mention, also, if you look at the reserves in the world, Exxon, which is the largest private oil company, it's, when you're talking about Russia's reserves, and the reserves of like nation states, they're massive. So what do you say to the criticism of the divestment movement, that it's just symbolic and feckless and idealistic and only a bunch of young idealists, students?
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I mean, what I would really say is that we have to be pretty idealistic if we hope to tackle climate change. I think there's often this false premise that somehow we can operate within the boundaries of business as usual. No possibility of any form of risk in any way, and yet we're going to tackle a challenge on the scale and magnitude and urgency that humanity has literally never faced since we've been in existence. So I think, frankly, the science itself is quixotic. It is extremely ambitious, and perhaps that's why young people like us who perhaps are more focused on the science and less tied up with the financial considerations. I think Ben would probably admit we're operating on a very ambitious scale, but that's what science demands. And so, really, what divestment does is calls on world leaders in science and technology to stand with science and with the futures of their students, and to rise to this challenge that certainly is extremely large. And I think the other point, you mentioned how not all of the stranded assets are held by private firms from which we can divest. But that's really the other issue that Ben alluded to, which is that a lot of these companies, you mentioned Exxon specifically, we have data to prove that as little as about 2 years ago, Exxon was actively funding climate deniers about 1.5 miles from where I'm sitting here at MIT. And so when you are investing, when places like MIT and Harvard are investing in companies that are actively undermining the very science for which we stand, that's a big deal, and that's really the moral side of things that Ben talks about.
Yeah, and in terms of the MIT argument, well, first off, yeah, Exxon was playing games with the science as of 2 years ago. Under the new leadership, correct me if I'm wrong, but Rex Tillerson, the CEO, being in Houston, pretty familiar with the oil companies' positions on climate change, you'd actually be surprised how many how frank oil companies are. Even Rex Tillerson is like, isn't playing, he's not doubting the science anymore. He's just basically saying, don't do cap and trade. If we're going to do mitigate, just put a price on it, because it's easier for us. We can deal with that. Even Shell, is pretty frank, carbon price. Granted, with Koch Industries and like coal companies, there's still some games being played there. But you'd be surprised how kind of like, I guess, untenable, certain positions are on the science, and how energy companies are actually shifting. Granted, not coal, for the most part, but even like utilities that use coal, are pretty frank. But then again, and this is kind of a criticism of the divestment movement. You can't go to these companies, or divest from them. Why not instead advocate for a policy? Because it's the companies are like, don't hate the player, hate the game. You set the rules, we'll make money. That's kind of David Hohn's argument. Is saying because of these stranded assets, you just put a price on carbon, and we'll teach the world how to, carbon capture sequestration, and then you don't have to tell, these countries to leave their fossil fuel assets in the ground. I'm just kind of, there's a lot of different arguments there, but that was kind of the argument in MIT's debate, was saying, go advocate for a policy. What do you say to that criticism?
Yeah, so that's kind of coming off of the last question. I want to make a point on the last question on symbolism. That is a common...
Hey, David, I'm worried. So, sorry, if you could hold that to that, because, sorry, you're coming in a little faint on audio, and we want to make sure we capture it on the recording.
I'll put this closer to me.
Okay.
But, people do often say, this is symbolic. Now, this is essentially a rhetorical argument dressed up like a substantive one, because we know every day that we do politics, we know from history that symbols do have a huge impact on politics. They have huge impacts on the way that people think about problems. And politics has a huge impact on economics. So we know very clearly there's a direct chain from institutional norms, social norms, what people consider to be acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. Those things have an ultimate effect on economics through energy policy. And that brings your question.
Yeah, that symbols matter.
How is this going to actually make a difference? For a long time, we've had policy ideas about how to deal with this problem. And of course, one of the preferred solutions is simply try to calculate what the damages are due to emissions and come up with a Gaussian tax. That makes a lot of sense. It's economically efficient. It's market-based. We like that. The problem is that for a very long time, a couple of decades, we haven't had the political will or the pressure to actually do this. So it's not enough just to say, here's the solution, without having a way to generate the political will to do that. Now, that is a focus society's attention on the problem. They do tend to isolate politically the target industry, and especially the worst actors in that industry. And that makes them much more susceptible to government regulation. And there's pretty good agreement across the board that that's what we need for this problem. So people, right, either a carbon tax or something, but they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually mutually reinforcing. And I think people are starting to see that as divestment becomes more of a mainstream action.
kind of a call for action and that pressure. Yeah, the audio came in a little scratchy there, but go ahead, Geoffrey.
I would just sort of reinforce what Ben was saying. I mean, I think that the first thing to say is that, well, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but we don't hate these companies per se, right? We absolutely don't hate the people who work in them. You know, I mean, I think I heard an interesting analogy that someone made the other day. It'll sound a little strange, but they described fossil fuels in a way as humanity's embryonic fluid. And I think the metaphor here is that for decades, centuries, fossil fuels have sustained and fostered incredible growth and revolution in our lifestyles. Right? They've been the fluid in the egg that we've grown in. But at some point, you have to break free of the shell, basically see the sunlight, right? Use the sunlight. And, you know, after some time, this fluid starts to become poisonous and it starts to harm you. And I think that's really the perspective that, simply speaking as scientists, there isn't really a hatred, it's just a scientific recognition of what is necessary to overcome the climate crisis. And to kind of really go back to what Ben was saying, and to also answer your question about sort of whether we should be advocating for policies, that really is where the investment comes from. It's the recognition by people like Ben and myself. We work on renewable energy technology, but the thing that most people don't realize is that we actually already have most of the technologies we need to begin tackling the climate crisis. There are, of course, huge hurdles to overcome, that's what the technology is, but we have what we need to begin. The problem, and this is something that people have recognized for decades now, is that we simply need a price on carbon, because without it, there's just an unfair market playing field. You know, fossil fuels are subsidized between 5 to 10 times more than renewables globally right now. And so that's really where divestment comes in. It's a political tool that students, especially young people like ourselves, have at our disposal for leveraging the megaphones that our institutions have to public and political opinion.
Yeah, and those institutions are the ones that are, the drivers of innovation, the university system.
That's right. Basically,
it's not just an institution. I mean, those are
right. Basically, the point is that if what we're saying to our administrators is that if you're analytic about where the real bottlenecks to tackling climate change are, you really need to put more energy behind things like divestment for political actions, because otherwise the technologies that we're developing in the lab will just never make it out into the real world. You don't actually make the difference that they're designed to.
But you're asking them to take a moral stance, are you not?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really sort of by taking a moral stance and saying, going beyond what scientists perhaps are usually comfortable with, and saying, this is the challenge of our generation, it's a singular crisis, and we're going to do whatever it takes to fix it. And that means working on the technologies, the research, the education, but it also means calling out the bad actors. You know, I mean, you're totally right that companies like Exxon and Shell and the fossil fuel companies, publicly, they certainly, they have moved away from their positions of denying the realities of human-caused climate change, and they are more sort of progressive in what they say. But it's a simple fact that still today, climate deniers in Congress receive about 4 times more fossil fuel industry funding than non-deniers in Congress. And, just a couple of months ago, the Senate voted that climate change is not caused by humans. And so when you have that kind of political environment, how can you hope to get a price on carbon? Yeah. And in turn, develop the technologies that we really need. So it's all part of, like Ben put it, a mutually reinforcing strategy. There's nothing... It's kind of a false dichotomy that I think we often face. Why do this when we can do that? Yeah. We should be doing both.
And speaking from someone from Houston, Texas, oil and gas, energy capital of the world, and just being in a conservative state, there's only like a kind of nascent divestment movement on campuses in Texas. But I was impressed after kind of checking out on Twitter, the different universities kind of having some serious events and kind of causing some disruption and kind of filling up campuses hallways and not just the Berkeley, I mean, we're talking University of Maryland, Tulane, Michigan, just, I was actually pretty impressed. I mean, how is the movement coming? This is very much a young movement, very much a student-led movement. I liked Miss Louie's quote saying, this is coming from a generation that is not yet politically powerful. Yet they're the ones kind of taking the lead on this. I mean, how's it coming across the nation as leaders of this movement?
Ben, do you want to go first, and then I can? It's always a little bit like reading the tea leaves. How is it going compared to how it could be going? What effect will it have? With a problem like this, what we're ultimately trying to do is have an impact that will matter in 50 years. So there's always a little bit of imagination and interpretation required. But that being said, the way that the movement has grown from a few isolated campaigns to thousands of campaigns globally, now to kind of coalescing into a social movement with its own values, its own willingness to accept certain degrees of risk. Like you see students getting arrested at various universities. A few weeks ago, 19 students at Yale were arrested for occupying the president's office about divestment. You see a lot. But the intensity of the movement is increasing quickly, and the numbers of the movement are increasing quickly. And you see real action on institutions actually doing it. So what was once considered to be crazy and inconceivable a few years ago when we started is now looking almost inevitable, almost a matter of time. And I think you do see a lot of young people getting involved because this is different from, it's not exactly environmental. The students doing this because they care about the environment. They're doing it because they have been taught in classes that this is one of the biggest threats, climate change, to their future. And they know what the causes are, or they know at least what some of the causes are. And so they're going to take action to protect their own futures and things that they care about. And so that's one of the reasons that I think this is really inevitable, that as time goes on, obvious and state that, we shouldn't fund companies that are engaged in climate change denial. We shouldn't fund companies or support companies that are actively blocking legislation that would shift the market away from fossil fuels. And the third issue is that the fossil industry does continue to invest on the order of $500 billion a year in developing new reserves. Now, that inflates the carbon bubble further, and that creates an incentive not to actually leave those reserves stranded, because that's an economic hit. So, their actions, at least those three things, those are easily identifiable. Those three things all run counter to keeping climate change mitigated as much as possible, and hopefully within 2 degrees if we can.
Yeah. And Geoffrey, you mentioned you're an MIT Energy Fellow. You're kind of at the forefront of the technology in terms of on the mitigation front. You mentioned we have the technology now to rebut that. David Hone, CO2 advisor for Shell, recently mentioned how we need to recognize the challenge that we're facing. You're talking about industrial burners. It's really hard to run a steel mill on just solar and wind. Germany's paying extremely high prices because they try to just go renewable, yet they can't. They didn't turn to nuclear, and they don't really have a source for baseload power. I know MIT and Professor Sadoway. I recently heard a event with him talking about the liquid battery technology. Seems really cool in terms of, I guess, kind of getting over the hurdle of, because wind and solar, they're unreliable on a grid. So, when they drop, you go to coal. And also we're talking about jet travel. There's no alternative fuel for, airline travel. There's no alternative fuel for heavy ocean transport. And what he's saying is, we got to recognize that, this is a huge technological challenge. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so you see, you have to be careful with the way you put it, and I was careful to say that we have the technology to begin tackling this crisis, right? And I'm not trying to pass words, I'm trying to be sort of scientifically accurate about this. Essentially, some of the issues you brought up, for example, the intermittency and storage issues and transmission issues with things like solar and wind, certainly, do become a big issue when you get above about 20 or 30% of your energy supply coming from this technology. But the reality is we're at less than, I think, 1% in the US. And so it's really a sort of, if you think about it like when we went to the moon, if we said, we're not gonna try until we know we've got everything in place. Yeah. We just never would have done it, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
There is an element of throwing your cap over the wall and then you're forced to climb over and get it, And so the thing is, we do have such great potential, as Germany is illustrating, to go from essentially zero to quite significant with nothing new at all. And so what we're really saying as scientists and technologists is that how can we expect to have all of the technological solutions in place, every single component, when there simply isn't any market demand for it, when the government is funding subsidies with subsidies 10-to-1 fossil fuels to renewables. So it's really about creating the market incentives to build the technological innovation at places like MIT and Harvard. I think, two other thoughts is, David Hearn, I heard him speak at the UN climate talks in Lima in Peru last December. I was a youth delegate at those UN climate negotiations. And, talking about sort of technological false solutions, he was really there saying, why should we divest when carbon capture and sequestration can deal with this problem?
Yeah,
to be frank,
that's an exception to the rule of the, okay, we can use these. They aren't stranded if we just sequester the emissions.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, as far as I know, it's pretty much the only exception. There are, of course, serious consequences that would still result. You still have massive ocean acidification, and impacts on organisms in that way. But aside from that, I think from a technological perspective, my impression is that carbon capture and sequestration is probably a much bigger gamble than solar or wind. It's not a proven technology at scale. I think there's just been one plant opened recently, last October in Canada at scale with CPS. It cost several $1 billion, and they're now thinking about closing it because it's so uneconomical. Whereas we have incredible expansion in solar and wind worldwide, an incredible fall in price that just continues every year. And the other thing is, going back to what we were discussing about sort of how the movement is progressing globally, I think it is, it's very, very exciting that young people are very much at the forefront of it. But I think it's important to also recognize that this isn't just a campaign of young people. Maybe a couple of weeks ago, the United Nations came out in support of fossil fuel divestment. Ben pointed out to me that just today, Prince Charles in the UK decided to divest and is endorsing this campaign.
The HSBC actually, posted up kind of a warning, to its investors, talking about stranded assets and if, the policies are put in place to actually make them stranded.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you have real grown-ups getting involved in this, one of the big announcements back in September, the day after the People's Climate March, was when the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is basically the heirs to the fortune of Exxon and Chevron and so on, decided to divest, because what they've said since then is that they tried shareholder engagement. They tried talking to their friends, and in some cases family members, involved in this business, and they were unable to shift the needle. And the World Council of Churches has divested. That's 590 million people. That's 8% of the world. So yeah, it's a serious power to be reckoned with. And I think it's important to emphasize that we don't want to destroy these companies. We simply want fossil fuel companies to become energy companies. And, I'm perfectly happy if they thrive off incredible profits from the energy revolution that we need. But we need them to actually, be spending less than fractions of 1% of their investments on technologies of the future compared to technologies of the past.
Yeah, all right. Well, we're out of time, but I welcome this conversation to continue in the forum. We're kind of celebrating at Earth Day, Texas. We've spent 16 months just focusing on the science at Climate Change National Forum, and kind of have a good foundation set, in terms of a working base of knowledge on just the basics of climate science and the science of climate change, and its implications. And now we're kind of putting it over to different voices in America and policymakers on the left and right to answer the question of what can or should be done. So I welcome, as leaders of the divestment movement, I welcome your voice in the forum too, so we can continue this dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That's a wrap.